Just before we start today's video, I've got to say, hot damn, this might be the best looking SSD that I've ever looked at here on the channel. Not so much on the SSD itself, which is easy on the eye, but the packaging. I'll be honest, a penchant for figurines, a penchant for little toys and Lego and stuff like that, and I've got to say, I really like this packaging. I like the fact that it reminds me of some of the figures that I get, some of my Batman figures. I like the way all the information is displayed. I kind of like that black and red all the way around, and although it has absolutely no bearing on the content of this video, I thought it would be heartbreaking and remiss not to at least highlight just how much a little loser like me likes this box. Hello and welcome back, and that is right, we are looking finally at the Patriot Viper SSD. We're going to be reviewing this SSD today. We're going to be doing a bunch of PC benchmark tests, and in a future video, and I say future, I mean in a matter of days, there will be a video where we look at PS5 testing for this. So if you're watching this video and you come for the PS5 testing, again, that video is coming, but I will refer to some PS5 stuff in this video, so I hope it does appease you. But this is the Viper VP3400. It's one of, I would argue, one of the most highly requested SSDs I've had here on the channel for a while. And that's not just for PS5 users either. Arriving at two capacities right now, in a 1TB and a 2TB model, $199 and $420 respectively. This is a very impressive SSD for what you're getting for your money for several key reasons. One of which I am going to talk about a little bit more later in the video is the controller. For those that aren't aware, the bulk of SSDs that have arrived for PCIe, I don't know what that squid thing was, that have arrived that support PCIe Gen 4x4 bandwidth, that is that 8,000 potential megabytes per second throughput there, that is PCIe Gen 4. The bulk of them have taken advantage of a controller from a company called Phison, the Phison E18 to be more specific. Now, it is still one of the highest performing controllers out there on the market. It is still one of the most popular out there in the market. However, there is another one. A company called Innogrit released their PCIe Gen 4 SSD controller, I think at the end of 2020. They sort of initially revealed it, a little bit more information and benchmarks. The Rainer there at the start of the year, and the IG5236 controller is what is featured in this. It's the same controller that's found in the ADATA XPG S70, the GAMX there that we've talked about in previous videos. That controller actually outpaces the Phison in a number of key areas. It's not as anywhere near widely available as we've seen in other SSDs, with the Phison largely dominating the market, but this is another SSD that has got that Innogrit controller, and I would argue, although there are pros and cons about whether it's better or worse as a controller, I will say that it is eking a great deal more out of a lot of these SSDs, and we are finding that a lot of the SSDs that use that controller are actually arriving at a better price point a lot of the time. Now, this SSD here arrives again at that $199 to $420 for the 1 and 2 TB, so not as affordable as some of the ones out there. It's by no means the most expensive, I would say, but with it you also get quite a lot of stuff. I'm not going to talk about the retail packaging. I already absolutely lost it there at the intro. I'm not going to talk about it anymore. This is the 1TB model we have here. And again, PCIe Gen 4x4, NVMe revision 1.4, so it's got all that going on. It's got the Innogrit controller there, which again, we've done comparisons against and we will look at closer later on. It takes advantage of DDR4, 2666 megahertz DRAM, 2 modules on the board there. If we get it out of that box there, which again, I'm reluctant to do. Have a look at it inside. Again, I'm going to talk about presentation. I'm so sorry. I really like the instruction manual. It's a silly thing. It really is. But this is one of those areas of presentation I think a lot of brands overlook, because a lot of people just use the internet where they can put out resources. But there is proper photos of setup there, actual application photos, something that a lot of brands don't include. Now, that's not for everyone, it's only for a small contingent of buyers, but it's still a nice little extra touch that no doubt had its impact at the point of production. Now, the SSD, it's also worth highlighting, arrives with two different thermal dissipation options inside. So the SSD actually arrives without the heatsink pre-applied. As you can see there, that is the 3400, the Patriot Viper. Inside we have, firstly, this one-use lower kind of profile dissipation heat pad there. So this is basically a metal panel that you can apply, and it has adhesive backed to go directly onto the SSD. So if you don't have space for a heatsink, or you're not using it in a high pressured heat environment, or you're using maybe a liquid cooling pass-through on your rig, like a small shuttle or something, and therefore a heatsink on board, there's just no space, then you have that option. It by no means dissipates anywhere near as much heat as that of a standard larger heatsink, but if you're already having a cooling system in place, you may prefer to use that single-use thermal metal panel there that goes straight on top. But obviously, the real star of the show there is a decent-sized heat dissipation pad there, heatsink and heat dissipation pad there attached to the bottom too. It's got those grooves there for assisted airflow over the heat sink there. It's a very small heatsink, I've got to say. It's got grooves built in, quite architecturally very well put together, but it's one of the smallest heatsinks I've utilised here on the channel. I mean, again, there's no argument that that's going to fit inside a PS5. That is going to fit sweet as a nut. I am going to be very interested to see just how much heat dissipation carries on. Indeed, I may have to perform a full temperature test on this for another video, simply because I'd love to know just how much heat this smaller but arguably denser heat sink actually dissipates from the SSD. It's branded, of course. If we move that slightly to the side, let's have a look at the SSD itself. And of course, the star of the show is right there at the top. That controller there at the top, that InnoGrit one. So straight away, in terms of performance of this SSD, in conjunction with, of course, the two, let's remove that label at the back, get that off of there, the two modules of memory there, SK Hynix there, mid-range either side there. This allows this drive, in conjunction with the NAND that I'll talk about in a moment, to reach performance benchmarks at the 1 TB level of 7,400 megabytes per second over 6,800 megabytes per second, making it one of the highest performing, if not the highest performing 1 TB SSDs in the market right now in PCIe Gen 4. At the 2 TB level, it's 7,400 over 6,800 again. So both of those SSDs with the same performance benchmark there. Particularly impressive for the 1 TB, I might add. In terms of IOPS, they both report over 800,000 read and write IOPS respectively. Again, fairly, good for the 2 TB, but particularly impressive for that 1 TB there. They've not cheapened out on the 1 TB. They've really layered into it, something that you do find with some brands, that whether it's the architecture and them going single-sided, not double-sided on the lower capacities, you find that the 1 TB and the 500 gig drives in most series, the performance in both IOPS and sequential read-write performance takes a bit of a hit, more write than read. They've not done that on this. They've kept it double-sided on the 1 and 2 TB, and again, we are looking at the 1 TB today. If we have a look there, we can have a little look at that NAND. The big chips there, we've got 2 chips there on the rear and 2 chips there on the back. So again, a good distribution of NAND there, and if we have a look, we can see a good arrangement of storage there, ready and available across them there. It takes advantage of Micron's 96-layer 3D TLC NAND, so a good level there, and that does reflect very well, given it's a 1 TB distributed across all of those chips, not only in over provisioning, of course, but in terms of durability, with the 1 TB rated at 1,000 terabytes written and the 2 TB at 2,000 terabytes written. That means the drive reports a drive writes per day DWPD of 0.5. So that puts it higher than 90% of the other SSDs in the market right now in terms of durability in this classification, PCIe Gen 4x4 M22280 length SSD. Now, the only SSD right now with a higher durability than this is, of course, the Seagate 5 CUDA at 0.7, which is great. But 0.5 at that price point with that controller, which again makes it quite unique. There's not a lot of SSDs right now that are reporting that. Means it does stand out a great deal in the market right now in terms of the architecture you're getting and what you're getting for your money. So right now, this has a lot to live up to. So let's make our way over to the test machine and run this through its paces in Crystal Disk, AJA, Atto and AS SSD to see if it can live up to its reputation. We've made our way onto the desktop of our test machine. As you can see, it has been picked up by Crystal Disk over here. And as we go, we can go and refresh the temperature. We can see that the drive has actually got quite a relatively high ongoing temperature there. If we go into the graph and look at the performance there, we can see it's been a consistent 40, starting at 39, and we've not performed any tests yet. So I do think this is an SSD that is going to run a little hot. Now again, we are using its own proprietary heatsink. We're using the chunkier heatsink for the VP4300, not the disposable single-use one. And on the left-hand side of the screen here, we can see the specifications that have been provided by the brand themselves. And again, that's utilizing that setup there. We're not using quite as an aggressive setup there, so our performance benchmarks might not be quite as high as these, but I think we're going to be within that ballpark. But we'll keep those there to look at. And of course, this SSD takes advantage of that Inogrit Rainer controller, the IG5236. And you can see that comparisons there conducted by CD Labs much earlier in the year. We can see that it did outpace that of the Phison E18 controller quite comfortably there in the majority of tests. So again, we will be looking at that there later on. So we've got that temperature. We're going to revisit the temperature later on in the video towards the end. And for now, what we're going to do is have a look at the SSD in a series of tests. I will highlight that a lot of the tests are not going to be conducted live, largely because of the screen recording software that we're utilizing here and a separate mic. Don't worry, that's not the microphone there. And the tests we're going to be utilizing today include the following. They're going to be including Crystal Disk. Don't worry about when the screen goes black there. That's just Windows asking for admin permission. We're going to do 3 tests on Crystal Disk. We're going to do 3 tests here on ASSSD in different file sizes. We're also going to run 3 tests on Atto Disk Benchmark. And again, these tests will be looking at both IOPS and general throughput. And of course, we will be looking at AJA, which is slightly less appropriate for these tests, but I include it just because we include AJA in all of our benchmarks. But bear in mind that you've got to look at this graph at the bottom. Don't bother looking at the top numbers. They're not appropriate. And also, just to give an example, this is why we don't use screen recording software during the course of our test. There's the Viper there. We run the test, and you can see these numbers are way lower than you would expect, and the graphs are all over the place. And a lot of that is because if we have a look at the task manager, we can see that OBS makes a relatively hefty dent in terms of utilization of all the resources here. And between GPU and CPU utilization, it just doesn't make testing fair when OBS is basically going to cap a lot of our performance or give negligible results. So although I could use an external GPU card that is currently set up with a PS5 rig while we're running continued PS5 performance testing. So I've got to do it in this way. Take my word for it, these tests are going to take about an hour to conduct. And at the end, we're going to look at 3 different tests from every different benchmark software, as well as revisiting the temperature to see just how well the Patriot Viper does in our PC benchmark testing here. So let's kick out, let's have a little look and go through, cancel all of these, and I'm going to start testing now. I'm going to close OBS and fast forward an hour for you guys to go through the results. Okay, so our tests have concluded and we can go through the results, and I'll be honest, for the most part they are a-okay, exactly what I expected from this SSD. Indeed, there are a few surprises along the way as well. Once again, on the left hand side of the screen we still have all of the benchmarks as provided by the brand themselves all the way there, in terms of IOPS, general performance and more. And of course we've got that benchmark there of another Rainer SSD there. So again, big capacities there, and with the 1 TBs there as well to deal with. So the first test we want to look at before we do anything was the temperature, because as mentioned, this SSD did seem to run a little hot early doors. But what I will say is, even though the SSD was quite hot, compared with other SSDs when it was in idle, 45 is, it started in the 40s, and again, with an average there of 45 throughout all of those tests. As warm as it seemed to be in its idle state compared to other SSDs, it didn't rise into the 60s as I've seen from other SSDs, and indeed it did a very good job of holding on to that temperature. Now, whether that is something that's built in thanks to that heatsink that it arrives with, this is one of those temperatures I actually, on the numbers and on point, actually quite like, because although it started warm, it never got too warm at any point, even during the more extensive and consistent tests like Atto. So again, quite impressed there. So let's go with the easiest to read test first. These are going to be Crystal Disk, and once again, this is 3 tests, all of which were conducted in Crystal Disk, all with around about a minute or so, or definitely more than a minute at least, between each test for cooldown. And as you can see in every scenario, same drive, but this time 1 gig, 4 gig and 16 gig test files, consistently maxing over 7,000. It never hit that total 7,400 that the brand themselves highlighted. Now again, that's because they were using a substantially higher performing test machine that we've got here, but these are still very respectable numbers for this machine. Indeed, the write performance there was consistently in the 6,000s, something we really like to see, something particularly in balanced use as well, something that tends to fall down quite substantially with a lot of the SSDs we test, and that was something that was absent here. Also, look at those read IOPS going over 1 million consistently in every single run. Again, given this SSD was rated at 800,000, and particularly in these tests that I'm running, the fact that it was able to cross into the 1 million 4K IOPS is something I'm surprised the brand doesn't shout about a lot more. Write performance all the way through was still consistently high as well, and overall, even in the mixed performance, very, very good indeed. Now, if we move into Atto Disk benchmarks, slightly more relative terms, relative performance benchmarks to Atto with what we were doing. Again, 256 megabytes or quarter of a gig, 1 gig and 4 gig file sizes, with IOs at 512 bytes all the way up to 64 meg. Again, in terms of write, we saw very late 5 gig verging on the 6 gigabytes there, so again maxing out at 5,900 or so megabytes per second write. So again, getting very close to that 6 gig that we saw in the previous performance test remarks there from Crystal Disk. Read again consistently in the 60s, lovely stuff all the way down, and again that counts all the way up to the larger 4 gig test file as well. If we flick into the IOPS, so again those are individual operation input outputs per second. Again, nice performance figures for the size we're going for there, and once again still continuing to show off the exact same figures that we saw previously, hitting those big numbers really early, even in the tiniest through to the biggest bench tests there. So after that we go into ASSSD, that's the wrong one there, ASSSD. In an ASSSD, again, a little bit of a stricter program, as we've talked about in the past. It has a tendency to do a lot more mixed testing, and ultimately, generally you find that the performance is normally 10 to 15% lower than those found in Crystal Disk, like for like. And again, lovely approachable figures there, maxing into the 5,000 write as well, which I was quite impressed with the 1 gig file. All the way through, lovely numbers consistently. And if we go into the IOPS on each of those, we can see that again the IOPS lovely and high, breaking into the 700,000 there, as highlighted by the brand themselves on their own page when they talk about the tools that were utilised, and again where it was rated from with regards to different tools. So again, very, very close, particularly for this test machine and its disparity against the one that they utilise. And of course, finally, we've got AJA. Ignore the big button numbers. These big numbers here are not relative to what we are utilising here for this burst mode, but do look at the graphs at the bottom. The graphs at the bottom are the ones that are going to tell us realistically how well and consistently it holds that performance benchmark. And again, hitting close to 6,000 writes capture all the way through in almost every single test there. It's got to be said that that is still a consistently high performance threshold, with the average there being very, very good all the way through. And again, that was consistent from the 1 to the 4 to the 16 gig. There was a slight dip, it has to be said here. If we have a look, we can see that dip in performance there. And again, that I think because it's the 16 gig file, we may I've maxed out the SD RAM, kind of overflushed it a little bit, but still, these have been some great figures to look at here, and definitely ones that verify that this drive can give what they say it can. I just wish we were using maybe an 8-core Xeon, or maybe even something a little bit hardier with a GPU card to really show off a lot of those benchmark numbers all the way through. And again, don't overlook the fact that that temperature there, although started warm, didn't go too high. Probably in part due to that heatsink, but also just due to the architecture of this drive and that inner grit controller there performing so well internally. But this has been the review and benchmark of this drive, the Viper, or the Patriot Viper VP4300. It's been one of the SSDs I've been waiting for a long time to get here on the test machine, and I'm looking forward to putting it through its paces on the PS5 shortly to see how it compares with a number of the big boys that we've been testing recently. I do recommend this drive, I would say. It's a little bit pricier than some of the drives out there. I think you are paying a little bit for the uniqueness of its architecture. Again, the only drive at the moment you can really compare it against in terms of its architecture is more likely the ADATA, a drive that we have already tested previously, and a lot of the benchmarks we saw on that were comparable between this and that drive, with both of them having very similar controller architecture, although a pinch higher in some of the benchmarks seen here on the Patriot Viper. But thanks so much for watching. Click like if you've enjoyed the video, subscribe to learn more. There should be a link to the review in the description and links to where to buy this drive if you are interested. Click subscribe if you want to keep abreast of all the SSD tests as well as the PS5 testing benchmarks and post-production SSD editing techniques that I'm going to be talking about very soon, so do look out for those. But otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I shall see you next time.